A very warm welcome to another TEL Researcher series session. Today we have an HE Researcher session. For those of you who are new to our series, the TEL Researchers is basically our name and brand of the series. But when we have a HE Researcher, as is the case today, we use HE Researchers hashtag instead. So before I introduce Paul to you, I am a PhD student at Lancaster University from cohort 14, one of the best cohorts. And John and Phil would like to introduce yourself very quickly.
Hi, I'm John Brindle, also cohort 14. I'm Learning Design Manager at Edge Hill University as well. Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to this talk.
Phil, would you like to say something?
Hi, nice to meet you all. I'm Phil. I'm one of the lecturers at the Centre for Technology Enhanced Learning, Department of Educational Research at Lancaster University. Nice to meet you all.
It is my absolute honour to introduce you Professor Paul Ashwin, who is a professor of higher education at the Department of Educational Research at Lancaster University, otherwise known as the spiritual home for John and myself. Paul is also the Deputy Director at the Centre for Global Higher Education. Some of Paul's research focuses on the educational role of higher education, how curriculum design can help transform the ways in which students understand themselves and the world. So we're not just stuffing random things into our teaching, they have to be purposeful. Paul's research in HE span across many areas as well, but I think the common thread is the quality of education, of higher education in particular, and what we can do to make a student learning better. Most importantly for me, if I could be selfish, Paul is my supervisor. So I'm really lucky indeed, and I'm really looking forward to this session. So on that note, now it's over to Paul.
Okay, great. So thanks, Puyin, for that lovely introduction, and hello everyone. As Puyin says, I'm Professor of Higher Education in the Department of Educational Research. So I've entitled this talk 3 slightly pompous lessons from my career trajectory. I think I have a tendency to pomposity which needs to be punctured every now and again. And what I'll do is I'm going to talk you through the kind of chronological way in which I ended up engaging in higher education research, and then draw some lessons from that. You've got my email address there and my Twitter. I do know it's called X, but the kind of juvenile new face of it I don't accept, so I still call it Twitter. I've got my Twitter address there, and if you want to get in contact with me and discuss anything afterwards, then you've got that information to do so. So to start off with, where I'm starting is where I started my undergraduate degree, which was when I went there, it was Kingston Polytechnic, and then as I graduated, it became Kingston University, and that's where I studied as an undergraduate, I think from the age of about 19, and I did a BA in applied social science, and what that degree involved was studying the politics, economics, sociology and philosophy of the welfare state. So it was an absolutely brilliant course, completely inspiring, completely brilliantly taught in a polytechnic. I think amongst the people I work with in Kingston in the department we were at, there was only one guy there who was a doctor, and all of the students were like, what does he do? He didn't seem to be as good as the other lecturers. And it was an absolutely brilliant course that kind of looked at these different aspects of the welfare state from different positions. So we kind of had modules on the politics of welfare, the economics of welfare, the sociology of welfare, and some stuff on its philosophical underpinnings. And when I was in the second year of my degree, I saw an advert to get involved in this thing, which was called supplemental instruction, which came over from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. So that the idea of that was that it was a way of second year students supporting first year students with things they found difficult. So it was a form of peer learning. So in my second year, I supported first year students to do that. And then in my third year, I was asked to help organise people who were in that role. And also because they had money from the Enterprise Initiative that had been set up as a national initiative from the Department of Education. I kind of went around the country with the person who ran it, Jenny Wallace, kind of promoting it to other institutions. And when I came to do my undergraduate dissertation, I then did it on this thing called SI, supplemental instruction. And as I say, kind of being at Kingston and the quality of the course that I studied there was a really formative experience to me. I kind of, school never quite made much sense to me for different reasons, but this kind of course was absolutely fantastic. And becoming involved in this form of peer learning really underpinned where I went in the future. So having done that degree, I then got a funded MSc, a British Academy funded MSc, to study the philosophy of sciences, philosophy of the social sciences at the London School of Economics. What I hadn't realised was that whilst at Kingston, what I'd done was philosophy from the perspective of social sciences, the course that I'd signed up for at the LSE was the social sciences from the perspective of philosophy. And I really struggled with that. I spent 2 terms writing essays that were always got feedback in pencil from the guy I was working with there, basically saying, this is not a philosophical argument. This is not a philosophical argument. This is not a philosophical argument. And it took me ages to come to terms with what a philosophical argument was and to understand this conceptual way of thinking that was different from what I'd done in my undergraduate degree. It was incredibly valuable, but it was really, really difficult. And then at the end there, I've kind of said that this was one of a really formative, important experience for me about realizing the difference between institutional quality and institutional prestige. So the London School of Economics, much, much, much more prestigious than the department I was in Kingston, and the quality of teaching was much, much, much lower than I'd experienced at Kingston. I can remember kind of being very, very, very keen student and kind of going to my supervisor for my master's dissertation, which was on a philosophical justification for democracy. I can remember going to see him and kind of having a chat about my thesis and what I do in my thesis or dissertation rather than my dissertation for the MSc, having a chat with him, and that was useful. And then at the end of the meeting, I said to him, "Oh, great, that's really helpful. Can we arrange our next meeting?" And he was like, No, you just go away and write it now. We don't meet again. That's it. So that was dissertation supervision at the LSE. And and the other thing that kind of to me signaled the lack of care is kind of in our final I think it was advanced social philosophy exam, we were told that we'd have to answer 3 questions in 3 hours, and then we got the exam paper on the day and it was 4 questions in 4 hours. And it kind of really summed up the lack of care and the lack of interest in teaching in that department. And so for me, the idea that this education being offered by the LSE was much, much better than the education being offered by Kingston is just complete nonsense. So whilst I was at the LSE, I worked part-time in an FE college in East London, Newham College of Further Education. And this came about because the person I worked with at Kingston, her then partner, was principal of this college. And he'd seen me at some conference talking about SI, supplemental instruction, and then wanted to offer me a job. I'd got the funded masters at the LSE, so I worked there part-time for a year, and then I kind of got a full-time job there where basically they employed me as part of student services to set up schemes across the college. So I was basically going into, I don't know, so this is a general FE college, so it kind of runs courses from kind of A levels, what were then kind of vocational courses, to kind of access to HE courses, to plumbing courses, to art and design, just very general further education college. And I went round to different departments to talk to them about how we could set up different schemes to use students to support each other. So it went from SI as a very structured scheme, and as I worked on that, it became clear that what we needed to do was to have more flexible ways of thinking about peer learning. So that kind of turned into my job. Newham College is a very diverse college. I think when I was there, it was over 70% minority ethnic students, and at the time was the poorest borough in England. And it was a kind of, it was a brilliant 7 years. We were a kind of team of us in student services who all got to know each other, supported each other socially, and kind of worked in this mad environment. It was very, very much a presentism culture. You were expected to be there, for the hours you were there, and it was a very kind of particular way of working. And it was a mixture of brilliant and also completely exhausted. And I'm still all these years later, I'm still in contact with the people I work with there. And whilst I was there, I basically went to them and said, well, I'm setting up these peer learning schemes, but no one in this college knows more about it than I do. So, you really need me to be externally supervised to do this. And the cheapest way for you to pay for this is for you to pay for me to do a PhD. They bought this argument and funded me to do a part-time PhD. So that I then kind of started looking at these schemes as part of my PhD whilst working full-time. And that was kind of a very, very kind of interesting way of doing a PhD. And one of the things that's at the bottom of the slide there that happened to me was I got very into ideas of participatory action research. So Rowan and Reason, John Heron, the idea that, it's not just about you as a researcher, it's about enabling the participants to design the research in the way they wanted. And so I was working with these students who were supporting other students, and I kind of introduced these ideas to them. And they basically looked at me and they said, well, we're not interested in doing that. We're interested in being involved in peer learning. We can see what we can get from that. But it's your PhD, it's your research. Why would we want to be involved in participatory action research? And that was kind of like a really important lesson to me, that actually what I was trying to do and what the students were trying to do were different kinds of things. And so sometimes as researchers, we can kind of quite earnestly think that we're being empowering, but actually what we're doing and what other people are doing are different things. And sometimes we can be a bit tempted to kind of think that something that's empowering is actually just reflective of what we're interested in rather than what reflective of what other people are interested in. So I worked there for 7 years, got my PhD, and then kind of thought, okay, well, I'm interested in getting research jobs. And I applied for a job at the University of Oxford. And I could still remember phoning them up from my office at Newham and phoning them up and basically saying, well, I'm applying from an FE college. I've got a PhD, but I'm applying for an FE college in East London. Is there any point in me applying for this job at Oxford? And Buzz on the phone kind of went, yeah, well, obviously we need to look at all applications. So I then kind of threw in an application and then ended up in a postdoc position at the University of Oxford, where I was basically employed to research students' learning at the University of Oxford. And kind of, whilst the SI stuff happened because of the enterprise initiative, at this time, which was started there in 2000, HEFGE was giving funding to institutions if they produced a teaching and learning strategy. So around that time, you got all kinds of academic development units. This one, Oxford, which was called the Institute for the Advancement of University Learning, it's now called the Oxford Institute. An institute at King's, an institute at UCL, an institute at Edinburgh, that all used this funding from HEFGE to do development work, but also to set up research into students' learning. So I was employed to work with Keith Trigwell, who'd come over from the University of Sydney, to basically, under Keith's guidance, set up a project where we went around the undergraduate colleges, got over half the undergraduate colleges involved, and researched what it was like to study at Oxford, both kind of using approaches to learning questionnaires and bits of phenomenography. And Keith Trigwell introduced me to phenomenography that I still use today. And at the same time, I also in the same institute worked with Monica McLean, who was very interested in critical pedagogy. And we kind of did quite a bit of work together and kind of did work trying to think about the links between phenomenography and critical pedagogy. And, and both Keith and Monica are people I'm still in contact with today. And both were incredibly generous and played a real role in helping me develop my ideas and introducing me to other people and introducing me to kind of other ways of researching. The thing about being at Oxford was, well, for me, was that, there were some people at Oxford who were absolutely off the scale. I can remember Keith and I had a meeting with the sociologist Anthony Heath about kind of things we were trying to measure, and it was just, it was just absolutely amazing to see. He would appear to be asleep in the meeting, and then he'd suddenly come up with all this stuff, and you'd be like, oh my God, this is amazing. But people like that were few and far between. Generally, the people I met and worked with and got to know at Oxford were about as clever as the people I got to know and I worked with at Newham. There were differences, how quickly they tell you how clever they were. They were much more likely to do that at Oxford. But in terms of what they seem to have about them, there was very little difference. And also if I thought about the students I worked with at Newham, and if they came to Oxford, Oxford would make no sense to them at all. And even with kind of very committed people at Oxford who really wanted to open up access to Oxford, you'd have a conversation that would go so far, and then you can say, well, but the thing that's excluding about Oxford is the culture. And and from their perspective, they'd look at me as if I was mad to say, but Oxford is its culture. And so where I kind of ended up with Oxford is kind of a sense of, Oxford is Oxford. It does a particular thing. When I look at those college walls now, I very much see them as keeping people out rather than anything else. But it gives a very particular form of elite education. And that's not particularly the problem. The problem is that it says it takes the brightest and the best, and it doesn't. And so for me, a great lesson from Oxford is this sense of we so often mistake social privilege for academic ability, and it's a complete mistake. So I then worked there for about 4 years, for 4 years, and then got the job here at Lancaster. So I joined as a lecturer in 2004. I mentioned there that, particularly kind of important in terms of me was, working with Carolyn Jackson, who's just in that office there, who I still work with and is still a really important person to discuss ideas with. And Murray Saunders and Paul Chowler in the department were all kind of really generous, again, introduced me to new ideas, introduced me to new people, made connections, were incredibly generous with that. And that was really important. And then after I'd moved to Lancaster, Monica McLean was putting together a project with me and Andrew Abbas looking at longitudinally at studying sociology in four English universities. And basically 2 of those universities were always at the top of league tables, 2 of them were always at the bottom of league tables for sociology. And we spent 3 years looking at the quality, tracking students through, and basically found that sense of prestige tells you nothing about quality. One of the very prestigious universities, the much less prestigious universities clearly had better quality than the other 2. So that was a really important project for me, and working with Monica and Andrea was just, brilliant. I then became a head of department for 10 years, which I finished last year. I'm now on sabbatical. And then kind of whilst I was head of department, Simon Margerson, who was at UCL, now at Oxford, was putting together a bid for an ESRC centre called the Centre for Global Higher Education, CG. And, you know, I kind of put a project into that, Simon's invitation, and working with Simon and Claire's been, again, really important. And then we had this project, kind of two projects, but linked, where we were looking at, so with the sociology project, we'd look at the transformational nature of higher education and how people experienced it. And people would always say, oh, but Paul, that's sociology, that's what you'd expect. So when I got offered the opportunity for this project, I thought, okay, right, what we're going to do is we're going to look at chemistry and chemical engineering, so that it's not what you'd expect in terms of transformation, and try and, you know, and chemical engineering is a version of chemistry. So we've got a kind of singular and regional version of the same subject. And we looked at it in, initially it was going to be two English and two South African universities. And then Jenny Case, who's mentioned there, was moving to the States and was part of the project. And so we added two US universities as well. So we ended up with two chemistry and chemical engineering degrees in two US, two English and two South African universities, with Alar, Ashish, Mags, Jenny, Benjamin, Yanya, Jan, Nicole, Kaylee and Renee, all mentioned there, all mixture of people from the US and South Africa. And it was a brilliant project to work with, and we're just coming to the end of that project now. We've got a funding extension to April for the whole of CG, and then that ends. And then part of what I'm doing on sabbatical is writing some papers as well as the book from that project. Alongside that, Jenny and I got another, so the ESRC had a call for research centres links between research centres in the UK and research centres in South Africa. So we were very well positioned to do that. And so Jenny and I put together this bid where we basically had a series of seminars that brought together researchers and practitioners from England and South Africa, trying to think about access to experiences of and outcomes from South African higher education. So that's kind of a version of my career and where I've got to. And there's just a couple of things that I'd say about that. So in terms of an intellectual trajectory, one thing that's kind of changed is the object that I think I'm looking about in my research. So when I was started off at Kingston and then at Newham and in my PhD looking at peer learning, it was all about learning. I was completely focused on learning. And then when I kind of went to Oxford and was looking at things like the tutorial system, I kind of began to realise that, yeah, learning's important, but actually teaching's important too. And I became really interested in the relationship between learning and teaching, and kind of see them kind of as very much connected rather than as separated. Whilst I was doing that, there were various people who kind of talked about this idea of curriculum, and I couldn't really understand what it meant, and I wasn't really very interested. And I kind of wondered what on earth they were going on about. And then I read the work of Basil Bernstein, and actually I started to realise why the way in which knowledge gets transformed into curriculum, and then how students transform that again when they learn it, is incredibly important. So then my research kind of really got into, and particularly through that pedagogic quality and inequality project with Monica McLean and Andrew Abbas, and the subsequent projects really focus on that. And now where my kind of thinking is at, and kind of reflected in the book I wrote, Transforming University Education Manifesto, is kind of going beyond that to try and think about, when we talk about educating, when we offer an education, what does that mean? And that's kind of the way I think about it now. But, you know, hopefully you can see that clearly education includes knowledge and curriculum. Knowledge and curriculum includes learning and teaching teaching includes learning. So it's not really a moving away, it's just a building on and seeing things kind of differently, and beginning to understand the whole in different ways across what would be. So what I've taught you through there would be for about, getting on for 30 years of working on this stuff. So yeah, it would be over 30 years. So yeah, so that's kind of how my thinking about the object of my research has changed. But then also alongside that is a change in the way that I think about theories and methods. And that plural is important. So I kind of, and when I started at Lancaster, I was very much like, theory is everything. Where is this PhD student's theory? They don't know anything about theory. And I was very, very kind of like, well, if you don't have a theory, you can't see anything, which I kind of still hold that position, but I'm now much more interested in theories. And the way I would see a theory is it's just a way of simplifying the world in order to deal with it. So the world exceeds our capacity to know it. It's so multidimensional. It's so complex. So in order to engage with the world, we have to simplify. And that's what theories do. They kind of say, OK, what would this look like if I looked at it in terms of an activity system? Or what would it look like if I looked at it as in terms of Bourdieu's concept of capital, habitus and field? Or what would it look like if I looked at it from the perspective of Bernstein's notion of the pedagogic device? But it's not really the pedagogic device. It's not really field, capital and habitus. It's just a way of simplifying in order to make sense of it. So kind of my initial kind of hard line on theory is I'm now much more, well, yeah, you do need a theory, but it doesn't answer all your questions. And similarly, I kind of went on a kind of search for research methods. So kind of, as often happens, I kind of was struck with the sense that, really most research in higher education is based on people's accounts. We either get them to fill in questionnaires or we talk to them in interviews. And what do any of these accounts mean? How can we get closer to the action? Well, maybe we can use observation and ethnography, but that's still through our lens and you can't take everything in. And actually, there isn't a perfect research method. Research method is always limited and flawed. There's always questions we didn't ask. There's always things we can't see. So again, with methods, I've gone from a sense that somehow you can get to reality to saying, OK, well, just accept that we can get fragments and we can organize those fragments in certain ways, but it's always limited and it's always flawed. And that doesn't mean that anything goes. We need to be precise about, when we have a theory or theories, what does it allow us to see? And we can't bring all of those theories together in a theory of everything. So there is no godlike view. We have to say we've got a limited view and try and be as reflexive as we can about the ways in which our view is limited. Similarly, and recognize that theory will highlight some things and obscure other things. So, a lot of critique in higher education is a bit like, well, you've used the wrong theory. Well, no, what are you trying to do? Have you used a theory that's the right thing for what you're trying to do? And so there is no right theory. There's no theory you should use. What you want is a simplification that allows you to ask the questions you want to ask. And similarly, all data is flawed. So let's just be clear about what we've got access to and what we haven't got access to. So if we've got an interview study about people's practices, let's be clear that what we have is people's accounts of their practices. So let's not go beyond that and say we know what people do in practice, because we don't. We just know their account of practice. Now, we might want to make a joining argument to say, OK, if we've got access to their account and we've got this, then we might have a good argument for what they do in practice. But let's at least recognize that that's something different. So for me, that kind of, it's about research is messy, but we still need to be precise. Some people's reaction to the world is complex and messy is, oh, well, anything goes. And I have completely the opposite reaction is, given the world is so complex and messy, if we're going to say something meaningful, we need to be precise about what we're doing and why what we're doing is flawed. So just 2 more slides, don't worry, there will be time for questions. So here are my 3 slightly pompous lessons that I take from that trajectory. So first of all, I would say, being a researcher, certainly doing my job, is an absolute privilege. Okay, and with that privilege comes responsibilities. So you need to follow knowledge where it takes you. You know, it's not about using your research as a vehicle to say what you would have said anyway. Basil Bernstein, who I mentioned before, says this is an ethical issue. If you're going to interview people and you already know how you're going to interpret what they say, so if you say, oh, this is an example of Sean's habitus, but actually there's no space for Sean to challenge you in what he's saying, then why are you wasting Sean's time talking to him? You have to give knowledge and data the space to surprise you and prove that you're wrong. You also have the responsibility to speak up for that knowledge, to say to people, no, there's this evidence here that's really important. And as a head of department, I was really struck how often I'd be in meetings where before the meeting you chat to people about this thing the university was going to do, and kind of you'd agree that you know, okay, we need to say something about this and point out why it's a problem, and then there would just be silence. And you know, it kind of, I took it as a responsibility for me to say things in those situations, you know, and that gets a bit naff, and if you're always the one saying it, it becomes a bit of a role, and that's not great. But there is a responsibility for when you know stuff and you're in a situation where you can draw on that knowledge, for you to speak up for that knowledge, whilst also recognizing that there's limits to what we know. And not enough people in research generally, but certainly in higher education research, will say, oh, actually, I don't know. You know, and I think we'd be a lot better off if people were happier saying, actually, I don't know. I can kind of think of a possible answer, but I don't actually know. And then if you have this knowledge, then to me, there's a real responsibility of making that available to other people through teaching, through impact activities, but you make it available in ways that make sense to them. Rather than saying, oh, no, you're not ready to understand this, or you're the wrong kind of knower. Actually, part of the responsibility is to try and find ways of making that accessible to other people. So that's the first slightly pompous lesson. The second one is this view that all bodies of knowledge are collective. You know, that's what's important about the knowledge we have at university, is that it's collective and it has a structure and it's not about individual. So a lot of the kind of culture of superstar individual researchers, I just think is nonsense, because it's about being stewards and spokespersons for the body of knowledge, the body of knowledge that's important, not the researcher. And so it's about reading widely, reading internationally, and in a spirit of intellectual generosity. So again, you know, I do feel that if we read more and wrote a bit less, then the world would probably be a better place. But also, when you're critiquing someone else's work, really think about, was that what they were trying to do? It is not critique to say, you haven't done the thing that I would have done. Actually, what were they trying to do in that piece of research, and how well have they achieved that? Rather than kind of saying, oh no, what they've done is they've been misled by the neoliberal imperative. You know, that's not critique. That's just kind of words. So actually think about what people were trying to do and how well they've done it. As I've tried to show, you can't do it on your own. All of the interesting things I've done and I've been privileged to do have come through connections with other people. They've come from links with other people. They've come from working with other people. And clearly, when you work with other people, you need to look after your side of the work. You know, it isn't particularly difficult. All you need to do is do what you'll say you'll do. If you get a bit late, let people know in advance that you've got a bit late, and then they think you're amazing. You know, it's kind of, it's basically good manners. And, you know, and clearly you need to have thoughts, and clearly you need to be methodical, but there's no kind of mysticism about it. So if you work with people, be straightforward, you know, be clear about what you can do and what you can't do, and make sure you meet deadlines. And then people will come back to you and they'll want you to do more stuff. Whereas, you know, if you kind of go, oh, well, it's very precious and very complicated, then people might not want to work with you. So there's that element of it. Then there's, you know, part of that remembering bodies of knowledge are collective is that then, particularly when you get to my stage of the career, it's about supporting and diversifying the range of perspectives. Because all theories simplify, we want as many different perspectives as we can in order to understand education. It's incredibly complicated. So we need to encourage a range of perspectives rather than kind of saying, oh no, I take this approach and this is the approach I take and this is the only approach that matters. To me, that's not looking after the body of knowledge. And clearly in my career, if I'd stuck with peer learning, where I started my PhD, I would be internationally renowned emperor of peer learning. But God, how boring. And for me, peer learning was only ever a way to get at issues of teaching and learning. So and then it's about, well, how do we get lots of different voices in there? And kind of quite often when people are talking about issues of EDI and encouraging diversity, it can be done in kind of, oh, because it's a good thing kind of way. And that's not it at all for me. If you have more diverse perspectives, you make better decisions. The quality of the work becomes better because you're seeing it from more perspectives. So to me, for the body of knowledge, that getting a diversity of perspectives is absolutely crucial so we can improve the quality of what we're doing. And then in bringing those ideas together, we have a real responsibility to think about how the world could be different than it is. Critique is not enough. It's a starting point. That kind of sense of, well, this isn't quite right is a really good way of beginning the thinking, but it's not the purpose of the research. We need to imagine the world is different, how it could be different. And we need to recognize that our version of that on its own is likely to be a bit rubbish, and we need to talk to other people about it and develop it further. I sometimes say the only worse thing than being ignored by policymakers is being listened to, and they take your idea and they turn it into something that looks horrific. So it's about making connections, it's about building networks, and it's about working together to think about how we can recognize a way of doing education that's different than the one we have at the moment, and recognizing that the most likely outcome is that we're not going to succeed in that, but it's still important to try. And then the third lesson is just about keeping things in their proper place, not becoming kind of so wowed by what you're doing that you forget about the rest of the world. So there's kind of a number of aspects to this. So first of all, when sometimes people are like, again, oh well policymakers are trying to do the wrong thing here. If you try and start a conversation with policymakers by telling them they're doing the wrong thing or they've misunderstood, why on earth would they listen to you? So you have to take the time to see the world from their perspective, to understand what they're trying to do, and then try and think ways and talk to them about ways in which you can help them do what they want to do, rather than telling them they're doing the wrong thing. Always, and this is kind of informed very much by Bourdieu, his version of reflexivity is that you turn your lens upon yourself. So he uses, the concepts of habitus, field, and capital, and he turns them on himself and thinks about himself as in a particular field, with a particular habitus, playing particular capital. And you must always think about, that sense of having integrity and thinking about, well, I say that about other people, but what about me? As a friend of mine always says, the problem of pointing a finger is that you've always got three pointing back at you. About you, and when you're making critiques of other people, apply that critique for yourself. As I've said, don't fall for prestige. Don't fall for, oh, it used to be brilliant. If you look on the literature on students, since the ancient Greeks, students have always been getting worse. It's a very common feeling. And the other feeling is, oh God, I became an academic 20 years too late. It used to be brilliant. Well, it kind of didn't, it didn't, so just kind of get on with the situation as it is, rather than kind of that seductive sense of, oh, I'm just out of time. And clearly in the things I've set out, luck played an enormous part in terms of the funding that was available for some of the different things I did, the people I met, the connections I made, the fact that the person I worked with when I was an undergraduate happened to be partner of someone at FE College who gave me a job, so it played a part, but having a sustained commitment to what you're trying to do is much more important to me, and that's what allows you to take use that luck and take the opportunity when it arises. What I do is incredibly important to me, but in the world, I make a mistake at work, no one notices, no one dies. It's kind of it's kind of luxury. Bourdieu has this great line of, the reason that so many academics are married to other academics is to maintain the fiction that what they do is important. And what I do is incredibly important to me, but it doesn't really matter. And, I'm normally, when I sit at kind of conferences that to me are important, think, well, if all these people suddenly disappear, well, the world wouldn't even notice. So it's kind of just about really recognizing what's important to you and what's important to the world, the two different things. And then two final points. So clearly in lots of ways I'm in a very privileged position, but my view is, don't go around apologizing for that, because you're basically trying to excuse it. Don't apologize for it, recognize it, and then be clear what you're doing with that privilege. If you've got a certain kind of privilege, something happened, how are you going to use that to do something beneficial? If you waste your time apologizing and enjoying kind of pontificating, then you haven't done enough with it. And that's far more problematic than having the privilege in the first place. And then my kind of really motivating mantra to myself is that in the end, we're all forgotten, we're all wrong, and we're all dead. No one's going to remember. So just get on and do the thing you think is really important. Don't kind of, what will other people think? Doesn't matter. No one's going to notice. Just do it and try. And if it goes wrong, well, that's that. Most things go wrong, but along the way, you end up doing something interesting. And to me, if you get to do research, if you get an academic position, if it doesn't feel like a privilege that you want to do something with, then get out of the space and give it over to someone else, because that to me is what the job is. So there you go. I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll open up for questions, and I hope that was useful.
That was unexpected.
In what way?
That we're all going to be forgotten. We're all wrong, and we're all going to. That bit wasn't expected. But thank you very much, Paul. Anyone has any questions or comments? Please feel free to raise your hand and see if there's anything in the chat.
And just to be clear, if it's about your research, I've got this thing and I'm wondering how to handle it, I am literally happy for you to ask me anything. I might not answer, but I'm very happy for you to ask me anything.
Michael.
Hi, Paul. Thanks very much. That was very interesting. So my university now, we're very much into interdisciplinary studies and research, and I wondered to what extent has your research been interdisciplinary, and how has that changed over your 30-year career? Yeah,
well, it kind of is and it isn't. So education is an interdisciplinary field of inquiry. So in that way it is. And in fact, I've just been part of a OECD review of higher education in Egypt, which has been quite interesting. And one of the things they've asked me to write something for them on is about interdisciplinarity and how that plays out. And to me, it's kind of, it's one of those things where I would say you have to have a lens to see the world. So one of the big challenges of interdisciplinarity is how you bring those lenses together. But it's a bit like if you put two pairs of glasses on top of each other, you don't see more, they refract through each other. So are you seeing one discipline through the lens of the other discipline, or the other way around? Where I really dislike interdisciplinarity is where basically what people do is, oh, we'll introduce students to the stuff and then they can make the connections themselves. I think that's just incredibly lazy, you know. So there's a sense of, well, how are you going to do it? Now, clearly my degree in that sense was an interdisciplinary degree. We took the object of the welfare state and we looked at its economics, we looked at its sociology, we looked at its politics. And well, I guess so some people would see that as multidisciplinary. But I would say there's so many things going on in interdisciplinarity. So one, it's kind of positioned as the new Kool-Aid, but it's not particularly new at all. So you look back at Lancaster and at the University of East London, they had these degrees in independent studies where students had no curriculum and they would just independently do a degree through interdisciplinary studies. So it's not particularly that new. It can mean so many different things. To me, I would always start with, whether it's research or designing a program, you know, what's the important, interesting work we're doing here? And if that involves bringing disciplines together, great. If it doesn't, why would you tie yourself in knots trying to do it? So that kind of institutional edict is just incredibly unhelpful. And what people tend to do very sensibly is they look for something they're doing anyway and they re-describe it in interdisciplinary terms. And certainly in terms of managing the demands of our institution, re-description is our friend. You know, most of the time, if you're asked to do something, you just need to be a bit creative and think, well, actually, what are they asking for? And what do I think is important? And is there a way I can combine what I think is important with what they're asking me to do? And sometimes there isn't, but normally there is. You know, and language is so porous and, you know, always negotiable. And, you know, if they've got a silly form, you can put the thing on the silly form. But normally there's a kind of space for us to think differently about it. And academics, by definition, are the most highly educated workforce in the world. And if we can't respond creatively, if we're like, oh no, look what they've done to me, then what hope is there for the world? You know, we're kind of going through a climate and nature emergency. If we can't creatively think about some workarounds. Now, don't get me wrong, Lancaster's a much easier context to do that than Newham College of Further Education was. Clearly, you know, the level, the affordance of that is different in different institutions. But at least to try and creatively think about, they want me to do this, how can I do something I think is really important? Like, you know, that to me is what I try and do. And as I say, sometimes it works, often it fails, but you know, no one notices.
I might be selfish and ask one then, if that's okay. So you talked about getting viewpoints and people's viewpoints. How do you ensure those viewpoints are authentic in the research? What's your views on that, and ensuring that the research is in some way authentic? Because you come across as a very authentic person, and you know, how do we reflect that in research, in the people that we meet and the people we enjoy? Yeah, I'm doing it purely jealously because you know my research.
so I would say that you kind of, I always assume people are authentic until I've got a reason to consider they're not. And certainly in say if I'm interviewing people, you know, what we try and do in our interviews is always to get to people's intention. Why are you doing, you know, so in fact, I was talking to a PhD student about this morning, you know, is when you're interviewing people, you're trying to find out, with the particular thing you're focused on, you know, what do you think you're trying to do here and why? You know, so if you know, so if you look at research on when I was interviewing tutors about tutorials at Oxford, I was really interested in, well, what for them is a tutorial and what are they trying to achieve in that space? And so the one thing you do is you show an interest in what they say. You know, even if you think it's the most horrific way of teaching in the world, that's not the space for you to get into that. What you're trying to do in that interview is see the world through their eyes. And clearly that's partial, it's flawed, it's incomplete, it's a particular, you know, I always, as part of that, I always try and get people to give me concrete examples of things rather than their espoused practice. You know, give me, you know, talk me through a particular tutorial rather than how do you do tutorials. If you do how do you do tutorials, you always get the tutor they want to be. Whereas if you say, oh, talk me through a particular tutorial, you get a bit closer, not completely close, but you know, it's as good as it gets. And for me, that's an element of it, of recognizing, that kind of fragmentary nature of the data we generate, and then honoring that through the process. So, I've kind of, with Keith, we did a lot of survey research, and I've done bits, but I've stopped doing it because I feel like, how much pressure do I want to put on someone ticking a box? Probably a bit bored, filling in this questionnaire because they've been caught out and they didn't manage to run away in time, and they're ticking a series of boxes, and then based on their reluctant, hurried responses, I want to make some great argument about education. To me, it's, a lot of it is just trying to be honest about, well, what are these data we've got? And sometimes we reify them and we get so far away from them. And then, if they're surveys, then we do structural equation modeling, and we do regression analysis, and we ignore all of the p-test controversy, and we want to talk about causation. Come on, get a grip. It's kind of, we're not, kind of, one of the things I always say is, the tools we have the precision of sledgehammers, not lasers. We're not calibrating, we're not doing, rocket surgery, or whichever way you put it. We're basically talking to people, and we're importantly trying to make some sense of it. But it is not, we are not using scalpels. We're roughly coming to an understanding of something. And always, when you're writing a PhD thesis means argument. So we're always arguing for a particular interpretation. And that's what gives us the humility. Because in making it as an argument, it contains within it the expectation that someone's going to come in and argue against us. And that's how it should be. It's all about arguments, interpretations, and shifting position, and having the intellectual generosity to be open about that, rather than, kind of, sometimes when I do presentations, particularly kind of in European settings, people will say to me things like, oh, so, what's your theory? What's the Paul Ashwin theory of da-da-da? And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm trying to do here. There aren't any particularly new ideas. All the things I've said today have been said by other people in other contexts in different ways. There are new contexts to bring ideas. There's new ways of putting ideas together. But there aren't atoms to be discovered in what we're doing. There's things we can bring together and try and be part of a conversation. So again, part of that authenticity is just kind of getting a bit real about the limitations of what we're doing. It is important, but it's also kind of a bit flawed, and that's as good as it gets.
Oh, thanks for that, Paul. Really interesting response to that. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'm gonna conclude to say that forget about being famous, just get on with it. I think that's what I got. I think a lot of us, when we started our doctoral research studies journey, we want to become someone. We want to, be the next big thing. But I think what I'm getting from Paul is, you might make it, you might not make it, but don't aim for it. If it happens,
I can really remember we had a very contentious staff meeting once when I was head of department, and someone turned around to me and went, well, it's all right for you, you're Paul Ashwin. And I was a bit like, well, in that sense, I haven't always, what does that mean anyway? And I think, to me, it's always about the work. It's always about being interested in the work. And then if other stuff happens, it happens. But if you're not doing work you believe in, then none of it's worth anything anyway. So it has to be about the work and contributing to knowledge, because that has the power, power to sustain you if you're doing that in partnership with other people who you love working with. I'll always work with anyone once, but a lot of the time it's only once, because if they don't do what they say they're going to do and they don't pull their weight, and then why would you work with them again?
Right, we're at time. I'm sure Paul's inbox is going to be drowned with private questions, because I know sometimes we don't want to ask questions publicly, and I do respect that.
And sorry, just to say one more thing on that, Pierre. Normally, I always give people my email address and Twitter, and people never send anything. So, which is fine by me, obviously. But if you send me something, I will reply, and it was a genuine offer. So just to be clear about that.
And so that concludes our session, and it also concludes our 2023 series. There's no more Thai Researcher or HT Researcher for 2023. So thank you very much, everyone, for all your support this year and this session as well. And we'll see you again next year.